But so the question is, what do we make of this huge mass, this immense list of gods, which doesn't sort of present itself as forming an obvious hierarchy that we can make sense of? So there's been a couple. I'm just going to talk about, do my bibliographic. Yeah, I'm a scholar. It's a habit. I can't shake it. Do my bibliographic work here. And so, if you, in terms of people who are working on North Chinese religion, there's different people have tried to answer this question of, essentially, how do we understand what Rotio saw to be a sort of a contentless religion? And so there's this guy, Adam Yuet Chow, who was working in a different part of North China, who was talking about miraculous response. So, which in Chinese would be lingying, the spiritual response, the spiritual reaction to whatever you do. So this is essentially different statues, different gods in different temples, maybe more or less, have more or less spiritual force. And if you go in there and you worship it, they'll give you a religion, or they'll give you the particular thing you wanted. And that and that's kind of the motive force of all of these cults. That was his explanation. You also have a professor now retired, formerly at Berkeley, where I am now, called David Johnson, who wrote a brilliant book called Spectacle and Sacrifice about North Chinese temple fairs. So saying that certain temples, at least, if not certain cults, had these huge events that would take place at them, where you would have massive temple fairs where, thousands and thousands of people would come, and there would be opera, and there would be miracle plays, and, the god would grant miracles to, people who came and prayed. And you would also have these huge New Year festivals, many of which were exorcistic. So all the people of the village would put on masks, and there would be a guy who was dressed as a chicken monkey with, covered in blood, and it was super gruesome. And, all these people dressed in the masks of the different gods would chase him through the village and beat him out to purify the village for the new year. So this is one thing they did. You also have this guy who's still working now, called Stephen Jones, who is working on the, liturgical or ritual traditions which are present in these villages today. So you have these groups of Taoists who are active in a lot of these areas now, and they can be called in by villages to do temple fairs, or to provide chanting and music at funerals, or to lead particular rituals. And so talking about these people as the liturgical group or ritual group who is seems to be today in charge of these temples. You also, of course, have Buddhist groups as well. But from my perspective, from the perspective of me interested in these murals, I don't think any of these explanations really explains what you see in this set of murals. So my own working theory, you could call it a heuristic. My method of understanding this is that these different gods attain their power through their position, their spatial position, essentially. And you can see this through their iconographies. So the way that I've divvied it up, and this just I've just made this up. It just seems like a useful way to understand it to me. Is that there's sort of three coordinates to a Chinese god, which or three ways that it might be depicted. So one, the god might be positioned in a particular place. So the god is located somewhere, or you might be located somewhere with respect to the god in space, and this gives the god power. Two, the god might do something in space. So the god might, be able to travel out into physical space and perform some action for you. So the god does something. Or three, the god isn't located somewhere, and it doesn't necessarily do something, but it's associated with a particular story or a particular set of information that you think is important or you value in some way. And then sort of four, it could be some combination of all of these things. So let's look at, finally, I know it's been a long time, I'm blathering. Let's actually look at some of these murals that I'm interested in, and presumably you're interested in, to try to talk about the main sort of iconographic tropes here. So although there's a huge number of gods, there's actually a fairly limited number of possible iconographies which exist in these things. So we're going to go through the basic ones and try to understand how these iconographies give the god power within the space of the village. So let me get up my notes here. Okay, so the first thing is, when you go into a temple is a little building. It's maybe, say, 10 feet wide. It's about 6 feet deep. Could be larger than that, could be smaller than that, but that's about the normal thing. And a temple will always have 3 walls. So, there's one wall has the door where you come in, but then there's going to be a front wall where there'll be an altar and an image of the god or image of the gods set up on the altar. And this is where you can do your praying and you can burn incense and you can put your offerings on the altar in front of the statue or just the images there. And then you'll have the 2 flanking walls. So you have to separate front wall iconographies from side wall iconographies. Unfortunately, lest that be too confusing, the front wall iconographies are actually all exactly the same. So you have basically only one composition on the front wall. And that is what I like to call the front court. So in all of these pictures, you see all of the gods seated there on thrones, surrounded as if they're standing in a court, whether it's the court of a heavenly palace or the court of the imperial palace or a court of law or a military court of some sort. But they're seated there on a throne. They're surrounded by their heavenly attendants and their generals who do their bidding, and the various other figures who are part of their retinue in terms of space, and they're all laid out facing you. And you'll see these floors underneath them that indicate that you should be thinking about this as a receding space. And this is the basic metaphor for what this temple is, and that it's drawing a relationship between your space and the space of the palace of the god. So all of these gods live in a particular palace. They're seated there in court as if they were in that palace, and you, by facing this image, you have kind of entered into that metaphor, and the palace of the god has become coterminous or confused with the space of the temple. So if you are facing this altar and you see all these people lined up, you are in some sense in the palace of the god, and that gives you a direct line of communication with the god. And that's the first and most basic way that any temple sort of visually communicates why this temple particularly is a good place to get in touch with the gods. I mean, why can't you just, pray to the gods outside or, in bed or something? It's because this temple is coterminous with the space of the divine palace where the gods are located. So that's the front wall. And then you have the side walls, and there's a much greater variety of different things which might exist on the side walls of Chinese temples. So the next type of thing, and these are not really in any order, so the next type of thing, and these are also my names, I should say. This is my categorization. You can disagree with it. Probably people will. I'd love it if somebody did. So the next thing that you have is the martial array. So this basically just continues the martial court scene onto the side walls. It's a continuation of the same idea. So in a lot of these front images, you'll see that the god is surrounded by these, soldiers or generals. They're called primordial generals, or great generals in Chinese, Yuanjun or Yuanjiang, who are standing there around him. And some of these, you have these figures extending out on either side down the side walls, so that when you go in, you're surrounded by this, martial, like a military drill where there's all these generals standing there like this, and you have entered in among them. You're surrounded by the powerful forces of this god, and then you can pray to him, and presumably he'll be able to send these, generals out to, smash your enemies or protect you from Mongols or whatever you want, really. So that one's pretty easy to understand. The next one is probably the most common type of sidewall iconography, which is Grotius calls it the pursuit of the evil ones. I'd call it the procession. They're not really mutually contradictory ideas, but so in the procession images, you see that the god is doing something. So Chinese temples, traditionally, you always had to be very careful about whether you opened or closed the door. So and there's very strict timetables for when you're allowed to open the door or close the door, because if you open the door, the god would go out, and he would start doing the things that he's supposed to be doing in the world. And, for instance, giving rain. So you might want him to give rain at a particular time of year, but then you might want to shut him up so he doesn't give rain at a different time of year when you don't want it. So the gods are thought to be able to travel out through the front door of the temple and do particular things. And you see these images of them doing it. So you might see all the gods riding out in the clouds with their attendants, and they're out. They're all carrying their weapons and their different implements, and they're out capturing evil spirits on the road. So and dragging them back in chains, so that all of the evil in the world is defeated. More commonly, though, with the dragon kings, you see them riding out to dispense rain. So on the right wall, and they always go clockwise around the room. So there's on the inner side of the room. Again, coterminous with the wall of the altar is the Crystal Palace, which is where the Dragon Kings live under the ocean. And then you see them riding out sort of in storm, and you see all of their mythological flunkies giving rain and the whole thing. And then on the opposite wall, they go back. Um, and there's this kind of sympathetic motion between the humans and the gods. So you'll see usually under these figures, under these big figures of the gods going about their business, you'll see these little figures of human beings, going about their agricultural work. So they'll be digging, and then as the they'll be digging and planting and harvesting, and then as the gods are heading back on the left side of the wall, having successfully dispensed rain, you'll see that as the gods are returning to their palace, the rainy season is ending. You'll see that the harvest festival, harvest ceremony is beginning with the humans down there. So you see they're all forming up into a little procession with a sham band and priests, and they're all arriving at a recursive drawing of the temple where this is all located. And so you have this, both the metaphor of the gods going out and doing particular things in space, which is why you worship the Dragon Kings, not because they're located somewhere, because you have a particular story about them, but mainly because they give you rain, right? So that's what you've drawn them doing. And then you have the sympathetic motion, your own procession through the year of you also doing this. Another set, so if you have a god which isn't located in some particular place, and the god doesn't necessarily do anything for you, but rather there's a particular story about this god which you think is important. So the most obvious example here is Guan Yu. So Guan Yu is the god who shows up in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or the hero who shows up in this, and he's not located somewhere. I mean, in the story he travels all around. And he doesn't necessarily do anything for you. I mean, I suppose he could sort of smite your enemies, but everybody knows that he's been dead for, by the time these were drawn, over 1,000 years. So why are you worshiping this guy? It's because you're interested in the story which is associated with him, and you see that story depicted on the walls. So you can actually follow along on the wall and read the story off of the wall. So I'm going to do this with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I'm not much of a Romance of the Three Kingdoms scholar, but I mean, you can go panel by panel and just read the captions off and see what's going on. So if we look through these, you have, so Hu Ban is making his surrender. And then you have raising an army to campaign against Cao Cao. Cao Cao is sort of the villain of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And then if you go down, you have taking Xiangyang by stratagem. So Xiangyang is the city. You can see he's fighting outside of the city gates. And then going on down, you can have immediately beheading Xiahou Cun. Again, I don't know the story. I've read it a long time ago, but this is somebody he kills, obviously. The army advances to attack the city of Fan. Again, he takes another city. He's always involved in these martial exploits. Skipping ahead a bit, so you have he dams the waters to drown 7 armies, and I really like this one. You can see all of the little heads in the water. It's cute. And then going on, he Yu Jin pleads for his life, so he's pulled this guy out of the water. And then shooting General Cheng He with an arrow. So he shoots the guy across the water, I guess. I don't know. As I said, I don't know the story, but you get the point that you can actually, it's not about a particular place, and it's not even about the gods is going to do these things for you. It's not like the people who live in this village need these things. It's about your respect for this particular story. And there can be, an almost unlimited type of other lists. So it can be other hagiographies, very common ones. You have the life of the Buddha, or you have the enlightenment story of the perfected warrior. But you can also have just interesting lists of things which you think are important. So you have a couple of places where there are just depictions of all of the possible jobs you could have. So you'll have, and this is, 19th century lists where you'll have, the people, the farmers, and then you'll have the Fletchers, the clothes makers, the weapon makers, the bookmakers, and these long lists of the different possible jobs which are there. So it can be essentially any list of things or any story which you associate with this god. Finally, another interesting thing, which doesn't really fit into our categorization here, but it's quite worth talking about, and this shows up very late in the 19th and early 20th century, is that, and also it usually shows up on the walls of opera stages. So around that time, most of these villages begin to build opera stages. But you have what I would call the portico drawings. So these are these depictions of these, these huge sort of porticos facing out into the space. And then behind them, these Western influenced images of these huge mansions rising up story upon story. And in the case of an opera stage, these are depicted just outside of the wall that divides the front stage from the backstage. In Chinese, it's called the guimen, the ghost gates, through which you can go through into the backstage. And so these, in an opera stage, they depict the kind of imaginary, the portico or entranceway, the outer facade of this imaginary interior to which the opera stage leads, which kind of extends back into, fictional or sort of, religious space. And in the case of a temple drawing, it leads into the altar. So you see the space behind this palace, again, accentuating the idea of the temple as a kind of anteroom or court space of the gods. You see that this is the facade of a temple, which leads back into the realms of the gods, which are located just behind this wall here. So that's a basic typology of what types of compositions are out there, and and how I think, again, I'm still working on this. I want to go back and find more so that I can get all the extant examples and see if I'm right about a lot of this, see if there's other compositions that I don't know about. This is everything I've found out so far, but so this is my categorization of how this art sort of functions in space, what it does and how people interact with it. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. And in the next section, 3 and 4, we'll actually look at some of the individual iconographies of each of these gods, try to get to know them up to personally, and look at more of the really fun details and stories which show up in these murals. So thank you guys for listening. As always, thank you for donating. If you haven't seen any of the previous videos, I have a fundraiser. It's gofundme.com/Northern Chinese Frescoes. And yeah, thank you guys very much. I will be buying a ticket to China in the next few weeks, and I will be leaving in December. So, yep, have a good day.